So Janet, we're discussing some good things about practical steps that we can take in helping people who might be suffering. And the next thing that I think we might want to talk about are ethical considerations. There's a lot wrapped up inside of all of this that we're discussing that's probably really important for us to really consider well. And so I want you to talk to us a little bit about some of the ethical considerations that we might want to have when helping those who may be struggling with mental disorders.
I always start with confidentiality. In some ways, I would say that this is the core, this is the primary ethical consideration. What we talk about has to remain confidential. If in fact this space where we enter in and we hear somebody's story is sacred, right? This is their story. It's not my story to share. If I want that person to feel safe and I want them to trust me, then I have to hold their story confidentially.
Yeah.
Right? Harm comes if I don't. And when you think about a church community, and even the largest churches have a small community, even telling one person breaks down trust. And a lot of the things that people share with us are hard things. These aren't things that they feel comfortable with other people knowing. And so I want them to know absolutely that if they come and talk to me, it's not going anywhere. Right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't only affect my relationship with them, but it affects their relationship with the church. It affects their relationship with God. Can I trust?
Yeah. And in the Church of the Nazarene, we take that as a significant thing that we need to consider. Even in the manual, it talks about the role of confidentiality and the importance of ministers having confidentiality with those that they provide care for, and really spells that out well in the manual. In fact, it's in section 538:17. And that, if anyone,
very clear statement.
Yeah, if anyone wants to go read that, that will probably be really sufficient to give how we in the Church of the Nazarene think about confidentiality for sure. But let's ask this question: are there times when confidentiality should be broken?
There are very few and far between. And typically, when I sit down and talk to someone, I am mandated to do this as a therapist, but I even do this a lot of times when I'm functioning as a pastor, and I say things like this to get up to some of those exceptions. Everything you say here is confidential. It is only between you and me, but there are some exceptions to that, right? And the first exception is if there is a significant risk of harm to yourself or to other people. And when we talk about other people, that can be abuse or neglect, typically of a child or someone else who, an older adult who can't really care for themselves, or someone who has special needs. So in those cases, we may need to report that to authorities. The second time would be risk to self, risk to others, abuse and neglect. The third thing I should say, would be if for some reason your records would be called into court. And that's not going to happen very often in a church, probably. It is much more likely to happen when I'm functioning as a mental health counselor. But it is important for us to remember that there is that possibility of the work that we're doing being called into court.
Yeah, that's really important to consider. And that raises another question as we think about confidentiality. Should we take notes when we're meeting with somebody? So we have a record. You're talking about records.
Right.
What does that look like?
I do think it's important to keep track of how often we meet with someone, typically when, where. If I keep notes, it would be just the general, when I'm functioning as a pastor, just the general theme, perhaps, of what we're talking about. I want to be careful that the notes are not too detailed, right? Because if for some reason they would end up in court, then whatever is written down in those notes, you would be responsible for being able to talk about. But more important than that, it's for the safety of the person. I want enough information so that I can kind of track what we're doing together. But I don't want enough information that if these notes would ever be found out, and hopefully I'm going to do everything I can to keep that from happening, I don't want them to tell the person's story.
Yeah.
Right. And so I would caution church leaders from keeping too much written down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Janet, let's talk about some situations where, let's say, for example, maybe a lay minister or a pastor would want their spouse in the room while they're talking to someone that they're providing care for. If that's the case, what should happen in that situation?
Right. I would say first, we need to be aware that when you introduce someone else into the room to watch, you change the dynamics.
Okay.
Absolutely. Second, we need to talk to the person to see if this is something that they're okay with. I really do want to get consent from them because if they tell their story in the presence of a third party, it changes the dynamics. But now you have to trust two people instead of one person. Mm-hmm. And the more people you include in that conversation, the greater the risk is for your story getting out. And that can be scary. I think, too, we have to be careful in that situation because in some states, at least here in the United States, in some states, when a third person hears the conversation between a pastor and whoever it is that they're counseling, it is no longer protected under pastoral confidentiality. Right? And so that's something that we really need to think through before we do it. I would also suggest that if we think with some people we need to have our spouse in there so that we feel comfortable if we sit and counsel with them, then we need to do so with all people. Because if we just pick and choose who we have a third person in the room with, it begins to communicate some people are safe and some people aren't safe.
Yeah. So it might be a policy that is really put into place as a general practice across the board, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I would highly recommend, instead of bringing a third person into the room, unless it's at the request of the person who's being counseled, that we do things to have people around, but not hearing the conversation and not witnessing the conversation. So can there be other people in the building, in the office suite, in the church? Can there be a window in the door? Other things that suggest there's some safety, right? There's other eyes on what's happening, but they're not listening and hearing.
Yeah, that's good. So let's talk about something you mentioned in a previous video, which is the fact that in a therapy session with a professional, it's like a surgery room.
Yes.
But then you kind of went on and talked about how with a pastor, it's a little different because the dynamic of the relationship has multiple tentacles to it, if you will. And they probably intersect with individuals in a whole host of scenarios and in different roles. So how does that get managed well as we're thinking about all of this?
So the clinical term for that would be multiple role relationships.
Okay.
Right. And as a therapist, I am going to avoid them as much as possible because I know it contaminates the therapy room.
Okay.
As pastors, we can't avoid them, right? And as church leaders, we can't avoid them. We are going to see one another at church events and on Sunday morning. And when we sit down together, and have a conversation and perhaps in small group and at the church yard sale, there's just no way, right? Because we as a church are living life together.
Yeah.
And I think in that way, sometimes it becomes important to have conversations about how we're going to manage that. And it may be when we meet together, we'll talk through the things that are going on in your life. But when we're out with other people, let's not go there. And that's typically how I would handle it with folks. I don't want to bring private conversation into a place where other people may become a part of that conversation. But it also raises the risk that, if I preach or teach and I refer to something, the person may think that I'm talking about them.
That's right. Yeah.
And I really want to almost get ahead of that before it happens and say, hey, this coming week, I'm going to be preaching about this. It may seem like there's something in there that's related to our conversations. And I just want you to know that it's not. But if you feel that way as I'm preaching, let's have a conversation about it, right? I want to remove any threat that's there for that person.
And being mindful enough to get ahead of it. So
Yes.
You're not responding after the fact or reacting after the fact. You're actually being proactive to make sure that you safeguard around that before that ever happens.
And even if I don't know, hey, this Sunday I'm going to be preaching on this, I can say in general, we know each other in lots of different ways, and you're going to hear me teaching quite a bit. And sometimes when I teach, I'm going to talk about things related, to your journey. And I just want you to know that I will not share your story in those moments. And I am not trying to say something to you in those moments that I would not have a conversation with you about. But if you have any concern about that, let's talk.
Yeah, that's really important. I think all of us have probably at some time in our life heard a sermon and wondered, hey,
Yes.
are they pointing at me? Or
we just talked about that this week.
That's right. And that's how the Holy Spirit works in our lives, is actually using preaching. But sometimes we can interpret that in certain ways that might not be accurate to what's really going on as well. So it's really important to have those conversations. Let's talk a little bit about the role of relationships and what can happen, or the risk of what could happen with things becoming inappropriate. Let's discuss that just a little bit, because when you're going through a struggle with someone, it can get really potentially risky for us. And we have to name that. We have to be honest about that.
Yes.
And so we want to make sure that we also discuss that. So talk to us about that a little bit.
Sure. This is probably one of the hardest things for us to talk about, right? Is what happens in these relationships when we're sharing just very personal, very intimate information with one another. And, we do talk about this in therapy and mental health work. I'm not sure we're as comfortable in the ministry talking about this. But you can imagine that if we're walking closely with people, that eventually we may have feelings of attraction for someone. It's not unusual. And I would say it's probably more common than we even like to expect, right? Or we like to think that it is. But I think owning that and being able to say, hey, I've noticed that I feel attracted to this person, becomes a really important part of dealing with it and managing it well.
Yeah.
And so what I tend to see in people is they want to shut that down and pretend that it's not true. And it tends to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? But if we can say, hey, I can call somebody who is an accountability partner or a friend that I trust and say, hey, I'm working with this person and I noticed this feeling in me. Can we talk about it? Typically what I'll find is that it's coming from some kind of issue that I have, some kind of unmet need, or just connection with this person.
Yeah.
But then how I walk through that, I need to do in community with somebody else.
Yeah, and not try to manage it alone.
Right.
Because the secretive nature of it can really cause more problems, thinking that we can just deal with it alone. We need someone that we can name it to.
Absolutely.
To help actually reduce the power of the temptation in those moments. And I think that's really important for us to talk about. It's not something that's fun to talk about in this video. I know that we don't necessarily want to talk about this. And yet we all know, no matter who's watching this, that this is a reality that we have to name. And I think it's really important that we do so. And so having that person that we can trust to just say, hey, you know what? Sometimes can you ask me questions about this individual and my relationship with them? I'm inviting you into that space because I need that. Again, it kind of comes back to the question that we raised earlier about boundaries. It's a way of setting a protective boundary around our own emotional makeup and our relationships to make sure that no harm is done to someone else.
Right. And I think that there is an unfair expectation that we have in the church that once we're in relationship, committed relationship, once we're in marriage, that we will never feel attraction for anyone else. That's just a lie. We are designed for a relationship, and sometimes it happens. But instead of acknowledging that and then walking through that and determining, okay, now if this is true, what are we going to do? We tend to push it down because there's so much shame, right? There must be something wrong with me if I'm feeling this way.
Yeah.
That creates a bigger problem in the end than just naming it and saying, hey, this happened.
And asking for that trusted person to walk with you through that.
Yes.
Together and not try to do it alone.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I would say that is not something that you talk to the person you're assisting with. You know, if I'm walking with somebody and I feel that attraction, it's not okay for me to say to that person, hey, I feel this attraction.
Right. Yes.
That's not the place to process that.
Right. Not with that person, but with someone else that you can trust. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we need to be able to do that. And this comes back again to John Wesley. And John Wesley had a lot of questions that were asked in accountability groups that would address things like this. Right. And coming back to being a confessional community means that we have to take those risks of vulnerability so that we can try to avoid the potential harm that can be done if we avoid it, dismiss it, deny it, suppress it, whatever we want to do to try to avoid the reality that we're going to have to deal with it.
Right. And there will be harm done. And I think that's something that we don't always understand. We regularly, unfortunately, see people cross this boundary and engage in inappropriate relationships. What we know from some of the psychological research is that if this happens between a therapist and a client, over 90% of those clients will have long-term significant harm done to them because of that. I think about ministry and the work that we do and the sacredness that's in the work that we do. And I can only imagine that even more people have even more harm when that boundary is crossed.
Yeah, that's really, really good to know. For sure.